Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today we're going to be talking about episode 5 of the Acolyte, the Disney Star Wars show that's, for the first time ever has been unanimously praised by everybody with the exact same opinions, and there's been no controversy or, division amongst the fans whatsoever. But we're here to talk about episode 5 of The Acolyte. And, I've been up and down on the show, although I've been mostly positive overall with, the 4 episodes that we have gotten. I do think that the 4th episode was my least favorite, mainly because it did feel like it was one episode that was cut in half right in the middle at the most dramatic point. And so it had very much unfulfilling arcs and just like a pacing that just didn't work for TV. But now we get the second half of that episode, so we're going to amend some of that stuff here. And, I think of everything, I really did enjoy episode 3, but I think that this episode is the first episode of this series that I've absolutely loved from beginning to end. This episode was a riot. I absolutely loved everything about it, and I cannot wait to talk about everything that happened in this episode because we find out a lot. We learn a lot of information, and we get a lot of great action. We get a lot of great character moments, and more importantly, we get an absolute slaughter that I cannot wait to talk about in full spoilers. So if you haven't watched the episode, go check it out on Disney Plus, come back, and let's get into this episode, which takes place exactly where we left off in the last episode. All the Jedi have, went to Kofar to confront Mae because, she's going there to, confront Kelnaka, which we found out was killed unceremoniously off camera. Still bugging me a little bit that happened, but at the end of the episode, we have all the Jedi lined up outside of Kelnaka's hut, Mae inside hiding, and you have this, hooded figure. People have dubbed him as Smilo Ren online, which I love that name. He has snuck up behind them, struck his red lightsaber, and blew everybody away. We're getting into the action right away in this episode. And we start off with Osha's perspective as she walks around. She hears the lightsabers clashing in the background until we quickly get to see that this guy is absolutely slaughtering all these red shirt Jedis that have, joined the team, that have tagged along in that last episode. And it is absolutely brutal. There's definitely, some points where they're, kind of hiding, some beheadings and some stuff like that, but it was absolutely brutal. There's one point where he even uses the Force to skewer 2 Jedi onto his lightsaber, and then he cuts their heads off. That was just crazy. I love the choreography in all of this, and I love what's actually what Yord has to say about this character.
He doesn't follow the rules of combat, and there's no method to his movements. It doesn't make sense.
And I really like the way that Yord describes this guy because, I think it goes to show how, the Jedi are not really taught about the Sith all too well inside of their Jedi training. And, us as fans, we know who the Sith are. We know what they mean. We know what they stand for. We know the rule to. We know all this sort of stuff. But what do the Jedi Order actually teach, their Padawans, growing up in this order? What do they teach them about this thing, especially when you're at a point in history where apparently a millennium has gone by without a Sith having any impact on this world, as we know from our legend that has broken a lot of Star Wars fans' brains, Ki-Adi-Mundi, in that last episode. But we know that, these characters are not used to the Sith, and so to confront one of them in this way, in this manner, is absolutely terrifying for all these characters. And I think that description really does hammer it home. And I also do think if it makes sense if, if the Jedi are not teaching their history about who the Sith are and how dangerous they could potentially be, if you don't learn from your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And so the rise of the Sith is inevitable. It's one of those things that, we know in Star Wars history is, the ignorance from the Jedi that kind of lets this, simmering evil, grow in the background until it was able to wipe them all out. But yeah, this episode is basically a giant fight scene from the very first scene to the very last scene. And so I want to break down this episode by character because I think each character had a role to play in the action in this episode that makes them each interesting in different ways. And let's start off with Yord because I already mentioned him. And of all the characters, I think he is probably my least favorite. And especially because he dies in this episode, we can really form our opinion on his character as a whole at this point. And, when he first came on screen and he's that type of dorky, goody two-shoes, rule follower, square type of character, I thought that's, a lot of people are making fun of him online and, panning him. And every time he walked on screen, I saw some reaction videos go, oh, Yord, it's Yord again. He's a very easy character to make fun of in the show because of the way that he was written. But I thought at first that maybe his role was written like this for a reason, that maybe, he's the type of character that by the end of the show, if say he was the only Jedi to survive, which I think if that were to happen, I think Star Wars fans would have lit the world on fire and just rioted in the streets because of how much people hate this guy for some reason. But I think if he were to have survived the very end of it, whereas everybody else died, he would 100% cover this all up because I can see him listening to, Vernestra or whoever is saying that we need to protect our standings in the Republic as political figures, and if we let all this out, it can ruin everything.
I don't want to have to subdue you, but I will. Come on.
And so, yeah, I thought of every single character, Yord would be the type of person that would pull that off, that it was building up to him to make that sort of decision. But, you know, he dies in this episode. He's brutally killed. His neck is snapped by the Sith character in this episode. And that was the end of him. And so, yeah, I guess by the end of this show, if he doesn't come back, which I'm pretty sure he's not going to come back, that's, Yeah, he didn't really play too interesting of a role. He played, I guess, an interesting foil to Jecki, being the type of character that was kind of the opposite, where Jecki was very forward and proactive as a Jedi Padawan, whereas, this guy is a little bit less proactive. Even in this episode when Sol tells him to take Osha to the ship, he's a coward. He's going to listen to that role. He seems very afraid in this moment, that he's really more so fighting for himself rather than fighting for others, which is kind of the more selfish mentality that some Jedi can have in this series. And, I think that makes sense. It makes sense for him as a character, and by the end of it, he says he finally agrees and he goes back to try to save the day, and of course he gets killed because of it. And so I don't really think anything really came out of the Yord character, unfortunately, although he did have like one really cool moment in the fight scene, which, yeah, hell yeah, that was great. But let's now get into Jecki, because I think Jecki was the MVP of this entire episode. And in I believe my first video that I had on this show, I said that there hasn't been a lot of Jecki for me to actually form an opinion of her, because, I love Dafne Keen in Logan. She was phenomenal in that, and I was very excited to see her cast in this, but I didn't think she had a lot to do in those first two episodes. Episode 3, she wasn't in it, and then episode 4, she had a great conversation between, her and Osha, and, some people have been shipping them together online. I love all that. That stuff is all great, but she hasn't really, left a big impression on me as an audience member. This episode, though, oh my god, Jecki was awesome. This is why you get Dafne Keen for a role like this, because she can pull off the action sequence. She's really great physically, like she was in Logan, and to see her take on the Sith and hold her own as long as she did as a Padawan, this is an awesome character. I think easily one of my favorite characters in this show now, mainly because of this episode, and easily the most brutal death and the most shocking death. The death in this episode that audibly made me stand up and go, what? That was absolutely crazy. And I was expecting a slaughter in this episode. I said it in the last episode, is like, this kind of has to be a slaughter because, these Jedi can't survive to tell the tale of the Sith, but my god, it was brutal. But to see the way that she maneuvered around this Sith, and the way that, this Sith character, Smilo Ren, every time, his helmet hit one of the lightsabers, it kind of disabled it, whatever technology he has in his armor. That was actually a really cool idea to have, to be able to disable a Jedi's weapon. That's a new thing in Star Wars that is actually pretty cool. But to see her, take Helnaka's lightsaber and to dual wield lightsabers at one point until, she finally loses one, and then she was killed at the end with just 3 brutal strikes, that was like, oh my god, this was almost unnecessarily brutal, but, it pulled a reaction out of Sol's character, which I thought was really interesting, because, he yells out and says she was a child to Smilo Ren, and, of course, Smilo Ren, fires back saying that, yeah, and you brought this child to battle, you brought this kid into this dangerous situation. That's what the Jedi have always done. They did that in Clone Wars, even mentioned that in Ahsoka, with, her entire argument with Anakin in the 5th episode of that show. And so, yeah, there has always been a lot of interesting stuff about, the morality of the Jedi, and, taking these children when they were young to train them for war, essentially, in the Clone Wars, and to do all these dangerous things with these children. And I think that this episode was one of the most brutal examples of that. But let's get into Mae and Osha in this episode, because they are supposed to be the leads of this show. And so, when it comes to Amandla Stenberg's performance, I do think that they are doing a solid job, playing these dual characters, but I can't help but to feel like I need a bit more from these characters, especially when it came into the last episode in Mae's flip-floppy, allegiances, where, she is at first, following this Qimir character, and then she betrays the Qimir character, says she's going to turn herself into the Jedi, and that doesn't end up happening. And you have this entire episode, some people theorize that maybe she did that on purpose to get Qimir to, or I guess the Sith character, to kill Helnaka for her, which is in turn killing a Jedi without a weapon. Some people are theorizing about that sort of stuff, but it just seems like she has very flip-floppy motivations. But what is very clear is that all she really does care about is her sister, and the fact that she is still alive is everything to her. And I think that Amandla is doing a good job portraying these emotions for the most part. I think that their performance, especially in the dual role of their conversation at the end of this episode, I do think it was cut a little bit weird. And I do think that, performing against yourself in a scene is difficult as an actor, and I don't think that it really did fully work for me in this episode. And I really hope that episode, 6, this upcoming episode, really dives into the dynamics between these two characters. And I really wish that they kind of stuck together and they ran off with each other at the end of this episode, but that didn't happen. Mae ended up going with Sol, disguising herself as Osha, which I think is a really interesting idea, to see Mae now infiltrate the Jedi Temple with, a Sol's character who maybe is really clouded, maybe his judgment is going to be very off, and if she does go as far as to get into the Jedi Temple itself, that could be an interesting storyline, or maybe she's just trying to get to Sol alone to be able to complete her mission in killing, all of these characters that have been tasked her by Qimir, which, we also get the reveal that Qimir is the Sith in this episode, which I'll get into in a second here. But, the allegiances with Mae have been very flip-floppy. Beginning of this episode, she wanted to turn herself in. Middle of this episode, she just kind of wanted to run away. End of this episode, now she's going off with Soul to presumably continue her, I guess, task of killing all 4 of these Jedi that's had something to do with, the death of her family. And so, again, I don't really know how I feel about that. And of course, Osha was left on this planet, and now Qimir is going to be the one to take her in at this point, which is kind of flip-flopping, them trading places, which is very Us. I had the Us poster up in my first video. I think it has never been more relevant than it is right now, which I love the fact that that ended up being like a relevant turn in this series. But either way, I like the place at the end, these characters. I love where they end up in this episode, but I do think that their motivations here have been the most flip-floppy and the most inconsistent in the show so far, so I'm curious to see how that's going to end off in the last 3 episodes. But let's get into Soul and Qimir in this episode, because I think that their interactions here were really interesting. It sparked a lot of theories that I have for the remaining 3 episodes here, but let's get into the big reveal this episode had in general, which was Qimir as Smilo Ren, which I love that name that was dubbed online. But Qimir is the Sith character that we have been trying to figure out who it was for this entire past week, and I will have to say a lot of people online, including some people I know in real life, but mainly this one critic that I have a lot of respect for. I think that they're a really great critic in a lot of other ways, but they were so convinced. They said in such like a whiny sort of tone that if it was Mother Coral that was a Sith, that it's going to ruin Star Wars, maybe not ruin Star Wars, but they said it was going to be really predictable and that they weren't going to like it at all, and that they were like so convinced that they're like, oh, I hate this. It's going to be the Switch character. I hate it already. And they're wrong. And so when it comes to the predictability of this show, this person was, saying that, oh, this show sucks because it's super predictable. Well, they were wrong. But on the other hand, I thought it was Qimir this entire time, and I was right. And to be quite frank, I thought it was really obvious and maybe a bit predictable. And so that's the tough part about predictability, and saying that a show is bad because it's predictable, is when you're wrong, then it wasn't predictable, and maybe the show is great because of it. Or maybe if you're right, like I was, maybe the show is bad because it's predictable. I don't think it's bad because it's predictable. I think that it was a good reveal. I think it was the right character to choose to be this character, because I think that Manny Jacinto as an actor, and the way he plays this Weasley character that has been kind of around in the background for the past few episodes, I loved his turn in this episode and the creepy performance that he had in it. It was really interesting to watch him throughout the entirety of this episode. And so yeah, maybe it is predictable, but again, I think the performance here and the action that we got with this character and the way that he fought and the philosophies that he has about the Jedi and about Soul and about all these characters is really interesting. I think the most interesting line in this entire episode is when this character asks Soul if he remembers him, if he has some recognition. Soul says something does feel familiar, but from what we know, Qimir and no men at all were, on the planet of Brendok when the whole witches thing happened with Osha and Mae and all that stuff. And so I don't think that this character is tied directly to the events of Brendok from episode 3. I don't think that is the case at all. I think that this is going to be actually a case of repeated history, and the fact that maybe these Jedi did kill all the witches on that island, which is something that I said wasn't going to happen in that first episode, which I wasn't sure how I'd like it if the Jedi literally went there to kill this entire other religious cult. And I'm starting to think that maybe it is true, because if you are the Jedi, if you are this overly powerful, presence in the entire galaxy, you're the main religion that everybody follows, that is, there's really nobody else that competes at this point in time. How do you keep that power? And you have that line that one of the witches had in that first, or in that third episode, which is, it is about who is allowed to wield that power. And let's just say that it is the case that the Jedi go off and they look for Padawans to, recruit into their religion, and say they find a religious cult that uses the Force in a way that is against their own in order to prevent other, religions from rising up and potentially turning to the dark side and becoming Sith, that they decide to wipe them out to prevent all that from happening. Maybe that's why they're so confident that there hasn't been Sith in a millennia, because they think that they've been able to, cover it all up and wipe it all up as time went on. And so maybe that was their mission all those years ago. Maybe these Jedi went there to recruit these younglings, and they saw that there's other people, and they decided to kill them all. That is super messed up. And if that wasn't the first time that has happened, and maybe they did that in the past, and Manny Jacinto's character was a little, Jedi youngling that was trying to be recruited, something went wrong, and the Jedi decided to wipe out their entire, people, and maybe Manny Jacinto lived in the same way that Mae lived, and so that's why they have that connection. That's why, Qimir wanted to recruit Mae for the same reasons, because he sees a lot of himself in that character. I think that is the direction that they could go in, which would solve many questions. It can solve the idea that maybe Ki-Adi-Mundi is also kind of behind this thing. Maybe this is a type of character that has been covering up all these, murders, all these essentially genocides against all these other religions to keep their own standing, to say that there has been no Sith in a millennium, because well, every time they've encountered another Force user, they've wiped them all out. But that's not the only direction it can go on. To get back to Yord, there's a line of dialogue that he has where he says, that this Sith character has a way of getting inside of your head, and that he just gets in your head and he stays there. And, Osha says that, my mother was able to do stuff like that as well. And so that also kind of pointed in the direction of making me think that maybe Mother Coral was the Sith, was Smilo Ren. In this episode, I was like, oh boy, are they going to be proven right? Are all these people complaining going to be proven right about it being the witch? But that line of dialogue is still important, because I do think that mind control that these witches portrayed in that third episode with controlling, Torben, I do think that's going to come back in some way, in some sort of, fashion, because it has to. When you set up a smoking gun, it has to have been fired at some point. And so I'm curious to see where that is going to go. I did say in my last episode that my prediction was that Qimir was going to be Smilo Ren, and that this was going to be the apprentice to the real Sith Lord, which we're going to find out was somebody else later on. And that is where I think that this witch character could come back. So maybe we're both right. Maybe it was Qimir. Maybe it is also Mother Coral. It could be the case. Maybe Mother Coral could be a Sith character, but I still don't think that Mother Coral would have been the motivator to, kill her entire witch coven, or I don't know what those motivations can be. I think it could also work, but I'm not sure if that will be the case. And so I do still think that it is a possibility that Qimir could just be the Padawan to a bigger threat in the future. That could very much be the case. But if he is a lone Sith, rogue character that has learned the Force all on his own and decided to take the power for himself in this power vacuum that has been created by the Jedi killing all these other Force users, I can also see that working, because by the end of this season, if Qimir is killed by Sol or by Osha or Mae or whoever that may be, and maybe they think that, yes, it was just this one lone Sith character, it's not worth to put in the Jedi records, because again, if it gets out that there was another Force user that was able to take out the Jedi, then from the eyes of the Republic, that the Jedi are going to be less useful. They're going to have a less higher, political standing, and that is why they cover it all up. That could all still work as well. And so yeah, that was the Acolyte episode 5. We have Mae and Osha split up and kind of reverse in their roles, with Mae going on with Sol back to the Jedi Temple or wherever they're going to go. You have Osha being left with Qimir, and then you have all the rest of the Jedi that have gone onto this planet, all being killed off, including poor Jecki, which of course was the MVP of this episode. God, she was so cool. I loved Jecki in this episode. Like, justice for Jecki. She had just such an amazing role in this episode that, God, I wish she did more in the past, 4 episodes of this show, but this is what we got, and it was one hell of a way to go out. But what are your thoughts on the Acolyte episode 5? And I'm genuinely curious. There's a certain section of fans that have, or I guess fans that have found something to complain about each and every single episode, and I'm curious what they're going to come up with in this one, because yeah, I don't know what they could possibly say, because I think this episode was absolutely phenomenal. But those are just going to be my thoughts on this episode. Like I said, leave a comment down below, and if you did enjoy, make sure you guys leave a like and subscribe to the channel to see more reviews just like this one, weekly Acolyte reviews from me, and also weekly movie reviews. I did just review Kinds of Kindness last week, and I'm going to be talking about A Quiet Place Day 1 this weekend. I'm very excited to see that movie, along with all other movies releasing here in the future. So thanks everybody for watching, and I hope to see you all in my next one.